Good morning, everybody. It's good to see you this morning. Thanks for being here for this time of Bible study. In this Sunday morning Bible class, we're studying a series of lessons called Rules to Live By. This is actually the second set or second edition of several lessons we've been studying, just describing different rules that we need to remember as we live our daily lives. This set of lessons has sort of emphasized popular or well-known expressions that are not really direct Bible quotes, but have biblical concepts behind them. Today, if you're looking at your study guide, we're on lesson 5. If you don't have that, don't worry. You'll be able to follow along. But lesson 5 says, no man is an island. That's a familiar statement, I think, to us. No man is an island. It's not a Bible quote. That statement is not found in the Bible. Actually, that statement was made popular by a man named John Donne, who lived in 16th century England. The quote actually is, no man is an island entire of itself. Every man is a piece of a continent, a part of the main. So, he was just saying, you are not isolated. You are in contact with others. You influence others. Others influence you. And that's just something that needs to be always remembered. There is a statement in the Scripture that's fairly close to that. Romans 14:7 says, none of us lives to himself and no one dies to himself. Well, that's really close, isn't it? And it conveys certainly the same notion. That is that, hey, listen, how I live is my business. It's none of your business. Keep your nose out of my business. That's what a lot of people want to say, right? But it's just not practically true at all. In reality, even though I can say how I live is none of your business, stay out of my business, the reality is how I live does influence you and others, and I got to take that into account. And how you live influences me, and you need to take that into account. And so the notion, no man is an island, although not a biblical expression, does convey a truth that we do have really a wide-ranging influence on other people. Any thoughts or comments, anybody? All right, let's start with a really familiar text in Matthew chapter 5. In Matthew chapter 5, we all know these verses really well, I think. Beginning verse 13, Matthew 5:13. Ye are the salt of the earth, but if the salt have lost his savor, wherewith shall it be salted? It is thenceforth good for nothing but to be cast out and be trodden under foot of men. Ye are the light of the world. A city that is set on a hill cannot be hid. Neither do men light a candle and put it under a bushel, but on a candlestick, and it giveth light unto all that are in the house. Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father which is in heaven. Well, we have studied that many times. We often quote it. Salt of the earth, light of the world are the expressions that Jesus used. Salt is a preservative, right? We don't do much of that anymore. Some people still do, but most of us are far removed from the idea of preserving our own meats by salting the meat. So salt was used, always has been used, to preserve things. And light, of course, we understand is necessary to be able to see your way. And so in both of those things, Jesus said that's what we're supposed to be in the world. We're supposed to be like a preservative in the world, the salt of the earth. Without good influence, without positive influence, the world just becomes a disaster, a chaotic disaster. If there's not guidance in regards to morality, if there's not guidance in regard to civil discipline and how people are supposed to behave, then just anarchy and chaos results. As a positive influence for good, teaching and showing by example how people ought to live and the better way to live that is described in the Word of God, we serve as as salt. We serve as a preservative. And that's how it ought to be. We need to realize that we have that essential role in this world. Certainly light makes it possible to see your way, to be able to move forward, to know what you ought to do. We serve as lights in the world. We're supposed to teach and again, by influence and example, show people the right way. So salt and light, we know those expressions very well. Any thoughts on that? Actually, although those verses are really familiar to us, they put a pretty heavy responsibility on us. This is a serious job. We need to take it seriously. The world needs us to do that. I guess we could say it that way. Tom?
Both of those, salt as a preservative, it allows for a certain amount of mobility, because if you can preserve things, you can take your food supply with you and, move around. So you're not an island, you're not just stagnant in one place. Rely exactly on what you have. Our early settlers here in the United States found that salt licks and various other things allow ways to progress, move westward. And light does the same thing. It allows you to move around in dark times. It can be used as guides, as like beacons on the seashore as protection, but also give direction. So you know where that beacon is, and you can use that to go various different places and find your way back.
Okay, all right. So salt and light, good analogies that Jesus used. Both of those, salt and light, require consistency. Because Jesus even said, if the salt's lost his savor, wherewith shall it be salt? In other words, I can't, as the salt of the earth, I can't say, well, I'm going to try to be a really good example most of the time. But occasionally, I will let down. Occasionally, I got to admit, occasionally I don't set a really great example for other people around me. But usually I do. Most of the time I do. I'm typically, pretty good. But I have to admit, there's times when I get way off course. Well, that if you had salt like that, if you were trying to preserve meat with salt that was somewhat good, but there was a considerable amount of impurity in it, and you tried to salt your meat with this salt that was pretty good salt, but it had, truth be known, you could get a handful of it that had a lot of impurity, and I'm counting on preserving my meat with this salt, but the salt sometimes is I get that salt and I trust that my meat is going to be preserved with that, but the salt's no good. The salt's got so many impurities in it that the meat is not preserved. Well, that'd be worthless, right? You would throw that salt out. As Jesus said, the only thing it's good for is to be cast out and trodden under the foot of man. If you're preserving meat, you want pure salt. You want salt that can be trusted to do its job. And that really speaks to us and the need for us to have a consistent example. We can't be good most of the time or usually good. We've got to strive to be the good example that Jesus wants all the time. Thoughts or comments? All right. So in this, now that statement that we were just studying, Matthew 5, that's Sermon on the Mount, right? That sermon continues. Before we go to that, in verse 16, Matthew 5:16 that we were just looking at, let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father which is in heaven. So live so others can see what you're doing. Okay. Now, here's a potential conflict with that in the same sermon. So the Sermon on the Mount continues in Matthew chapter 6. Jesus said in Matthew 6, verse 1, take heed that you do not your alms before men to be seen of them. Otherwise you have no reward of your Father which is in heaven. When thou doest thine alms, do not sound a trumpet before thee as the hypocrites do in the synagogue and in the streets, that they may have glory of men. Verily I say to you, they have their reward. It goes on, the text goes on. But Jesus, in this section of the Sermon on the Mount, said, be careful what you do that you're not doing it to be seen of men. Is that a conflict? Earlier in the sermon he says, let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works. Here he says, when you do your good works, don't do them in order to be seen of men. What's the difference there? What's the difference, Tom?
One is an observation that people see just because it's there. The other one is they see it because you brought it to their attention.
Okay.
It's bringing it out front and projecting it. Look at what I've done instead of people say, look at what he's done.
Yeah.
Did you know that he went there and he took groceries over to Sister So-and-so? No, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Why? Because he didn't tell everybody about it. He just did it.
Yeah.
Somebody observed him doing it.
Yeah.
And where the other one is, he goes down to the grocery. Hey, I'm buying all these groceries for Sister So-and-so. Tell everybody he's got it, and gets a parade following him over there. That's the difference.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. One is, people, if you're consistently doing good things, people will observe that. They're going to notice that. And not that you're doing it for that reason. If you're doing good deeds, sometimes your good deeds are not known by others. That's fine. Sometimes others find out about the good deeds that you've done, and they are positively influenced as a result of that. That's what Jesus is saying, let your light so shine before men. But in chapter 6, when he says, don't do your good deeds to be seen of men, if that's your full purpose, I'm going to do this, but before I do it, I'm going to sound a trumpet and get everybody's attention so that they'll be sure and see what I'm doing so that I can get their glory, that I can get praised by them. Jesus said, if that's what you're after, then when you get that praise, when you get that recognition, then you have the full reward that you're going to get. You're going to get a reward from God from doing that. So Jesus wasn't, I think the main point here is that Jesus wasn't contradicting himself. The first, let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works, is you're not doing it for that purpose. It's not your motivation. You want them to notice, look at Matthew 5:16 again. See your good works, that they may see your good works and glorify your Father. You're doing it to the glory of the Father, not for your personal glory. In the second case, when he says, don't do your good deeds to be seen of men, then that was the reward they were seeking. They weren't seeking to glorify the Father. They were seeking to be glorified themselves, and that was the difference. I know once years ago, not here, but at another place, we were really encouraging people to spend time reading their Bible every day. And it was decided that we'd put a little chart up in the entryway. And when you came in on Sunday, if you had read your Bible every day that week, you were supposed to put a little sticker or something on there so that we could say, oh, this week we had 20 people that read their Bible every day of the week. But there was a brother who objected to that, and he said, this is doing your works to be seen of men. What would be your thing on that? It wasn't a big deal, but we actually discontinued the practice because he objected to it. Would you think, what would be your judgment? Which way is this? Is this doing something good so that God will be glorified, or doing something good so that I'll be glorified? Any thoughts on that, James?
You have the names up the side.
No.
So it was anonymous,
Yeah.
people knew a number. That
Yeah.
really wasn't referring to anybody specific.
Yeah.
It's a good encouragement to say, are you going to do it? Or, we encourage you to do it, and we'll check to see. Encourage people to do it. If you're not putting your names up with it, I guess you could be proud of the church itself that we have that kind of problem.
Yeah.
If you had everybody do it and you went and told everybody, guess
Yeah.
what?
Yeah.
The devil can find ways to influence you back in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I didn't have a problem with that. I thought it was actually a pretty good thing to do, but we discontinued it because a fellow had an objection to it. But it's really all about motivation. Am I doing this to be seen of men, or am I doing this to glorify God? It's all about your motivation when you do that sort of thing. Mike?
You know, thing about that is it's like putting a number up there. Because, you know, people can lie. I mean, people not only capable of doing it, people actually do.
Sure.
So, I mean, that really, when it comes down to it, I wouldn't put much stock into it.
You can't, yeah. And some of that, of course, God knows our motivations perfectly. And so he would know whether I'm doing it just to get praise of men or otherwise. But, you know, I guess we'll have to leave some of that to God. Matt?
I've been places where they do. I don't know really that it's trying to brag or get praise of men or whatever, but I never really liked it. It's kind of, in my mind, it's kind of like, well, what do we do with that, with our contribution? Well, look at what we give this week.
Everybody who's given as much as $20 put a sticker on this chart. We wouldn't do that, would we? All right. JD?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with James. Like, I don't think there's really anything wrong with it. I mean, if you've got somebody who's already got the wrong motivation, I mean, you could see somebody making sure, you know, I'm going to make sure as many people as possible are standing in the foyer, and I'm going to, you know, try to be chatting somebody up while I, you know, put my sticker up there.
Oh, I got to put my sticker up. Hey, I forgot to put draw attention to myself when I go over. You could do it. It could be to be seen.
But that's a personal problem, really, with that person more than it is the system. You know?
Yeah, I think you're right. All right, let's move on. So when Jesus gave this warning about he said that the hypocrites do their works to be seen of men, and very often the ones he was complaining about were the Pharisees, who were those kind of hypocritical people who did their deeds to be seen of men. And he referred to them as a kind of leaven. Skip over to Matthew 23. Matthew 23, verse 1. Jesus spake to the multitude and said to his disciples, the scribes and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. All therefore whatsoever they bid you observe, that observe and do, but do not ye after their works, for they say and do not. For they bind heavy burdens and grievous to be borne, and lay them on men's shoulders, but they themselves will not move them with one of their fingers. So, again, to the same group of people, he's condemning them here as hypocrites, and they were very strong to tell everybody else what they ought to do. Here's what you ought to do. I myself, I don't do that. I'm not going to get my hands dirty. You all should help the poor. You should give alms to the poor. Me personally, not so much. And so Jesus really condemned them for that kind of hypocrisy. But he called that a sort of leaven, that if that kind of hypocrisy exists, it can spread like leaven through a lump of bread. He said that kind of bad influence, and our lesson here is about good and bad influence. That kind of bad influence can spread, and so that's the reason to be very careful about that. And Jesus urged to be careful of the leaven of the Pharisees. And we need to be aware of that too, that a bad influence can really spread quickly. Sometimes I think people imagine that we are nitpickers, that if someone does something or says something that's not true to the Word, and we feel a compulsion to point that out or bring attention to that. Oh, you guys are so picky. And the word judgmental always comes up. But the fact of the matter is, if a departure from truth is allowed to stand unchallenged or uncorrected, then the problem with that is it spreads. That evil influence spreads like leaven in a lump of bread. And so it's a challenge, and there's a lot of judgment involved in how to address various matters. But when an evil influence or false teaching is taking place, it's essential and necessary to speak up and address that so that the leaven doesn't spread, right? Tom?
How many times did Jesus go through talking to the Sadducees and Pharisees and scribes and things and saying, you err not knowing the scriptures? Where they were taking the scripture, taking it out of context, applying it to their doctrine and not to God. So, Jesus did that in his own teaching, and going back to the scriptures and showing them that, you're not doing what it says to begin with, and here's the reason why.
Don't you think that Jesus, in today's world, Jesus would be considered extremely judgmental, right? Don't you think he would be? His example is perfect. The way Jesus addressed things was perfect. But in today's politically correct world, he would be considered to be ultra judgmental, I'm sure. James?
And what we just read a moment ago, they were teaching the right things. He said, so listen to what they say and do it. The problem was the heart. That's pretty nitpicky, right? They're preaching right, the heart is wrong. That's super nitpicky, super judgmental.
Yeah,
Right?
yeah. In today's world, yeah.
In today's world, that's, you can't get any more picky than that. That's what Jesus said. And that's what we have. And it has to ultimately righteously determine our heart.
I think you're right. Good point. I think you're right. Okay, so how much are we a part of one another? No man is an island is the idea. Go to 1 Corinthians 12. We're not going to read all of this, but in 1 Corinthians 12, Jesus refers to us as dependent members of a body. 1 Corinthians 12:12. As the body is one and hath many members, and all the members of that one body, being many, are one body, so also is Christ. For by one Spirit are ye all baptized into one body, whether we be Jews or Gentiles, whether we be bond or free, and have all been made to drink into the one Spirit. For the body is not one member, but many. If the foot shall say, because I am not the hand, I am not of the body, is it therefore not of the body? And if the ear shall say, because I am not the eye, I am not of the body, is it therefore not of the body? If the whole body were an eye, where were the hearing? If the whole body were hearing, where were the smelling? And so on it goes. Paul here is really touching on the concept of our lesson. You are not isolated. You are not alone. Especially when we think of fellow Christians, and in particular fellow Christians in the local congregation. You are not an island. You are not independent of others. You are actually connected, like body members are connected to one another. And therefore, what you do and how you act influences every other part of the body. That really needs to be remembered. As I was saying earlier, I can't even begin to imagine how many times through the years when a Christian, in particular a Christian, a member in the local congregation, begins to become unfaithful, to fall away, to do things they shouldn't be doing, so often when you try to approach them, reach out to them, help them, they will say, it's none of your business. Leave me alone. Keep your nose out of my business. That is a very common comeback, and obviously it's a mistake to think that way. We are interconnected, like members of a body are interconnected. And as we've used that text so many times in the past, it's just your little finger gets hurt. So you're working, you fellas are working, and something happens, and just the very tip end of your little finger gets smashed. What does the body do? Well, the whole body jumps in response to just that one little part of a tiny member of the body. The whole rest of the body, I'm telling you, the whole body responds, right? The whole body hurts. It affects the whole body. And Paul's trying to get us to see that about us as a spiritual body. That what happens to one happens to all. What affects one affects all. You are not an island. Anybody? Thoughts or comments here? Okay. Let's skip down in that text just to verse 25. 1 Corinthians 12:25. There should be no schism in the body. The members should have the same care one for another. And whether one member suffer, all the members suffer with it. Or one member be honored, all the members rejoice with it. Now ye are the body of Christ, and members in particular. And so the mutual care, no division, no issue within the body. That's what we should be striving for. Couple passages here we may pass over. Let's skip to the parable of the Good Samaritan, Luke chapter 10. This is maybe the best known parable that Jesus taught. Jesus taught a lot of famous parables. But I think if you went out today and took a poll, you just walked the streets of Columbia this afternoon and said, name a parable that Jesus taught. Name a parable that Jesus taught. I wouldn't be surprised if the Good Samaritan would probably pop up most often because it's well known, you know. And even people who don't have any working knowledge of the Bible, they know the notion of the Good Samaritan. My car broke down on the road the other day, and a Good Samaritan stopped and helped me. People will say that, right? People who maybe don't have any knowledge of the Bible, don't ever go to church, would say, a Good Samaritan stopped to help me. Well, you remember that the parable of the Good Samaritan was taught when a fella asked Jesus. Look in Luke 10, verse 25. Behold, a certain lawyer stood up and tempted him, saying, Master, what shall I do to inherit eternal life? He said to him, What is written in the law? How readest thou? And he answering said, Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, with all thy strength, and with all thy mind, and thy neighbor as thyself. Jesus said to him, Thou hast answered right. This do, and thou shalt live. But he, willing to justify himself, said to Jesus, And who is my neighbor? All right, so he knew the answer. He had the right answer. You need to love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, soul, and mind, and thy neighbor as thyself. Love your neighbor as yourself. So he had the right answer. Jesus said, that's right. You got it. Do that. Well, the lawyer comes back and says, who actually is my neighbor anyway? Because notice he was trying to justify himself. I will help somebody if it can be determined that they are my neighbor. In other words, if I have a specific obligation to that exact person, I will act in their behalf. But I want to know, are they my neighbor? If they're not my neighbor, I'm not helping. If they are my neighbor, I understand I have a burden, and I will do what I have to do toward this class of people that can be specifically identified as my neighbor. So that's the way this guy was thinking. And Jesus proceeded to teach the well-known parable of the Good Samaritan. You know, so a man's traveling, he is beaten and robbed, probably left for dead or left to die by the injuries which he had suffered from the robbers. A priest comes and he's over here in the ditch, and the priest moves to the far side of the road and goes on by. A Levite does the same thing. He comes. Here's the injured man laying by the side of the road. He moves to the other side and goes on by. Here comes a Samaritan, sees him injured. The Samaritan doesn't know this guy. I think clearly the way the parable is taught. The Good Samaritan doesn't know the guy. And actually, probably, there would have been some ethnic tension between the injured man and the Samaritan. We know, surely that's the reason Jesus chose that as part of the parable, because we know the Jews and the Samaritans had a lot of ethnic strife between them. But the Samaritan man sees the injured fella and immediately goes to his aid. He doesn't know him. he's a total stranger to this guy, but he works in his to his well-being. You know the story. You know it very well. So when Jesus concludes the parable, verse 36 of Luke 10, Jesus asked the guy who wanted to know, who's my neighbor anyway? I want to know who my neighbor is. I'll help my neighbor if I have to, but I'm not helping anybody else. Jesus, after he told the parable, said, verse 36, which now of these three thinkest thou was neighbor unto him that fell among thieves? And he said, he that showed mercy on him. Then said Jesus unto him, go and do thou likewise. So the whole parable of the Good Samaritan was told to answer the question. Jesus told the parable to answer the question, who is my neighbor? And the answer that the parable illustrates is, really anybody and everybody is my neighbor. Any situation, any circumstance, any person constitutes a neighbor that I have, again, remember our point is, we're not islands, we're not isolated. So any person can potentially be that neighbor that I need to reach out to. Given occasion and ability, which constitutes opportunity, then I should act in regards to those people. But the point in connection to our lesson this morning is, we are not isolated. We're not isolated. I'm not isolated. I'm not isolated in my family. I'm not isolated in my local congregation. I'm not isolated in this community. I'm not isolated in the world. All the time, in all kinds of circumstances, I'm interconnected. And I need to realize that and use my connection with others in a positive way. Thoughts or comments, anybody? James?
It just kind of hit me at the very end when Jesus said, who proved to be the neighbor? So it's not the person that I'm considered as a neighbor. It's the person who proved to be of help was the neighbor. So, we think, who do we need to do something to? Who am I obligated to do something to? Who is my neighbor that I need to help? Jesus said, you need to be the one who's considered a neighbor. The person who was the helper was considered the neighbor. So we need to be looking for opportunities to be the neighbor instead of who is the person that I'm obligated to.
So I got here. These people are neighbors of mine. No, who am I a neighbor to? Yeah, good observation. I think you're right. All right. Let's look at Romans 14. Well, this is a tough text, and it's been sort of a battleground passage. Romans chapter 14. Paul describes a situation that exists in every church. It's not a situation we have to deal with specifically or particularly, but the concept is very applicable. Romans 14:1, him that is weak in the faith receive ye, but not to doubtful disputations. For one believeth that he may eat all things, another who is weak eateth herbs. Let not him that eateth despise him that eateth not, and let not him that which eateth not judge him that eateth, for God hath received him. So I think you all know this issue. The eating that's under consideration in Romans chapter 14 is the eating of meats that had been sacrificed to idols. So what was common practice, as we've described many times, is in these pagan cities of the first century, and almost every city that we read about in our New Testament could be considered a pagan city where there were idols and temples and shrines to idols. And those idol worshipers would make animal sacrifices to the pagan gods. But then after the sacrifice had been made, they would take the meat that was left and they would take it even to the common marketplaces and they would sell the meat. And so some first century Christians just had a really strong conscience about that. I conscientiously, I just don't feel that I can eat meat that has previously been offered as a sacrifice to idols, I can't do it. I just feel like it would be a violation. Other Christians felt like it didn't matter where the meat came from, and they felt that they could eat it. And it became a real strong point of contention in the first century church. If you go over in 1 Corinthians 8, Paul talks about the same circumstance, meats offered to idols. And in 1 Corinthians 8:8, he says, meat commendeth us not to God, for neither if we eat are we the better, neither if we eat not are we the worse. But take heed lest by any means this liberty of yours become a stumbling block to them that are weak. So the answer on eating meats, by the way, Paul had written, one of the very first epistles Paul wrote was 1 Corinthians. That was written before Romans. So the truth was out there. The truth was already out there. That eating meats to idols didn't matter. You could not. It didn't matter. If you chose to or chose not to, it didn't matter. But some Christians still had a conscience about it. And so Paul's point was, honor the conscience of others. You understand that you can eat those meats. This other guy does not have that understanding. And by the way, that guy was the one who was identified in Romans 14 as being weak. The guy who did not have that understanding and therefore was restricting himself more so than he needed to. The weak brother wasn't a guy just out here going willy-nilly doing everything. The weak brother of Romans 14 was the guy who was restricting himself more so than he needed to. Because he had this strong conscience. He could not bring himself to eat that meat that had been offered to idols. And so Paul was saying, he had already said, even before he wrote Romans 14, he had already by inspiration said, it doesn't matter. Do it or don't do it, doesn't matter. But don't let your liberty be a stumbling block to someone else. And that's the same point he's making in Romans 14 here. Don't let your liberty become a stumbling block. Look in Romans 14, verse 19, he says, let us therefore follow after things which make for peace and things wherewith one may edify another. For meat destroy not the work of God. All things indeed are pure, but if it is evil for that man who eateth with but it is evil for that man who eats with in offense. So, and there's a really good verse, the very end, the last verse of Romans 14. He that doubteth is damned if he eat, because he eateth not of faith, for whatsoever is not of faith is sin. So that guy who had a conscience against it should not violate his conscience. He had a strong conscience against eating the meat offered to idols. Therefore, he should not be eating it. You don't ever, an absolute truth is don't act in opposition to your conscience. Conscience can be misinformed, but at this moment, what your conscience says, don't ever do what your conscience says you shouldn't do, is a really powerful rule. And Paul affirms that here in Romans 14. But his whole point in this, Romans 14, the parallel subject in 1 Corinthians 8, also 1 Corinthians chapter 10, don't do, you may understand that you are free to eat that meat. But don't do it if it's going to cause an offense to a brother. And certainly don't flaunt that in front of someone who has a conscience against it. As I said earlier, this is not a point of eating. I don't know where I would ever find, where I live, in the place and time where I live, I don't know where I would ever find any meat that has been offered to an idol. This just doesn't happen around here, right? And so this is, someone said, wow, well, probably that's just totally inapplicable to us. No, it is applicable, because there are other, it states a principle that needs to be adhered to. And it all goes to the theme of our lesson this morning, is that we are not isolated. We are not an island. There are people around that we can have an influence for good or for bad. And so I need to be really careful. I'll give you an illustration. Years ago, way years ago, in the church where we were, there was a fella who had a conscience against playing cards, any kind of cards. Old Maid. You know, we played Old Maid with our kids. But he had a conscience against, the way he had been brought up is playing cards. Any kind of playing cards are wrong. You can't use playing cards. So, you know, sometimes, you know, we would get together, as folks still do, you know, get together and play rook or do something like that. We wouldn't invite him. And we wouldn't flaunt the idea that we were playing Old Maid with the kids. We would not flaunt that in his presence. We were honor his conscience. He's not going to do it. He feels badly about doing it. Don't torment him about that. Whether you play Old Maid or... So, using a paraphrase of Paul's expression, whether you play Old Maid or not, you are not better or worse. Right? I know that. I completely understand that. That guy doesn't. So I'm not going to torment him with this liberty that I have. I have the liberty to play Old Maid if I choose to. But I'm not going to flaunt my liberty in front of that guy to cause an offense or to cause a stumble. You see what I'm saying? That seems kind of, bizarre, but that was an actual case that we dealt with. But it's just illustrative of the concept. And the whole lesson this morning is in regards to know that you are connected. Know that you're not isolated. You're not alone. You're not an island. And what you do and how you do it is going to impact other people. Always remember that as you live your daily life. Thanks, everybody.